was turn Palantir into a completely privatized version of total information awareness. What would be needed to have the election canceled and martial law declared?
Are elections a sham? Behind the curtain are the same oligarchs controlling both parties. Why is your money disappearing? How did Wall Street seize the people's wealth with its going direct scheme? The modern blackmail network. How do tech, finance, and intelligence secure the elite's grip on power? What will the next crisis be? In the next economic collapse, will BlackRock be the savior or the trigger? Whitney Webb breaks down how the system really works and what it means for you.
Yeah, so J.D. Vance, as we know him today, wouldn't really exist without Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel started his venture capital career, bringing him on to Mithril Capital, which is one of these VC firms that Peter Thiel has created, and then also financed his entire political campaign. Well, not entirely, but made the biggest donation to a Senate campaign in U.S. history to J.D. Vance to get him elected to the Senate, and also was a major donor to start up J.D. Vance's own venture capital firm, which is called Narya Capital. And it's funny because another person who donated a lot of money to J.D. Vance's venture capital firm is Eric Schmidt, who's actually a big Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden donor that is the former head of Google and also the person that ran the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. So basically the person that charted out the CIA and military's AI policy, and has had an outsized role on science and tech policy in the Biden administration. So it just kind of goes to show you that, these kind of elections, I would argue, are sort of like, are we choosing for Eric Schmidt or Peter Thiel, Democrats or Republicans? Because Silicon Valley oligarchs really dominate both parties, but they ultimately agree on a lot more than they don't. So you have, for example, Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel coming together in backing J.D. Vance's own VC firm, but they're also together on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Conference, which is sort of this closed door conference of elites that's quite controversial. And even more secretive than things like the World Economic Forum's annual meeting and things like that. At least that's filmed and the public can watch it. Bilderberg is not quite that. But you'll have top intelligence figures, top government officials, and top people from, the corporate sector coming together to essentially collude about their agendas for the world going forward. So again, Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt tend to agree on a lot more than they don't. But they back politicians that have different rhetoric, but ultimately implement the same policies at the end of the day, which is, why we have this uniparty phenomenon that people over the past several years have been able to see. But, it seems like whenever there is an election year and a lot of election related content is out, people that knew about the uniparty seem to kind of forget that it's a thing and think that there are meaningful differences between the two parties. So as far as J.D. Vance goes, the ties to Peter Thiel are very important. He owes his political career to Peter Thiel, and he owes his very successful venture capital career to Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel is a problematic individual. He frames himself as a libertarian, but if you actually look at what he says about economics and his beliefs there, he's really much more of a fascist. His view is that free market competition is bad, that monopolies are good. And in his practice, when he set out to make these, de facto monopolies, which
according to Whitney Webb, while figures like Peter Thiel present themselves as libertarians, their true goal is creating monopolies. This reveals an anti-free market ideology and a model of state-backed capitalism intertwined with intelligence agencies, which forms the very foundation of his political power.
He did with PayPal and then Palantir, he built those monopolies with U.S. intelligence, like from the very beginning. With Palantir, it's very overt, but it's also been admitted as it relates to the origins of PayPal as well, that they were consulting every 3 and 4 letter agency in the United States as they were beginning to set up their company. So that to me is not a free market libertarian at all. That's someone who's a cartel market libertarian. And so he and some of the people in his network, I guess, which I sort of nicknamed the Thielverse, they basically adopt a lot of this so-called America First rhetoric, but in practice, they're just as bad as the other side, and support a lot of the same policies and the same wars. and things like that. But, aside from PayPal, one of the things that is most concerning about Peter Thiel is his involvement in Palantir. I mentioned earlier he had connections to Richard Pearl. He used Richard Pearl while he was setting up Palantir to connect him with the person that was running a surveillance program that was at that time being defunded by Congress that was called Total Information Awareness and was supposed to be housed in DARPA. And it was one of these, it was even more invasive into Americans' lives than the Patriot Act even was. And that's why it was defunded and the Patriot Act was not. And essentially what Peter Thiel did was turn Palantir into a completely privatized version of Total Information Awareness, because they correctly gambled that people had complained about the military having this program because it was housed in DARPA, which is part of the Pentagon. But if it was just a private sector venture, people wouldn't complain as much. And they were completely accurate about that. And so Peter Thiel not only privatized that failed DARPA program as Palantir, he also privatized another DARPA program that was shut down, but part of the same circle of surveillance, projects and proposed projects, and turned that into what is now Facebook. So Facebook existed before Peter Thiel got involved, but the person that provided the capital that put them on a map and actually gave them, enabled them to rise the way they have was Peter Thiel, who was on the board for decades and essentially directed a lot of their product development and what they would become. And I wrote an entire article about the similarities and development of Facebook to be a resurrection of the same DARPA surveillance program, where we freely give away our faces and everything we do in our lives, our events, where we are, our location, posting it for other people to see, but also for the government to harvest that data, which was the intention of that original DARPA program.
Webb highlights how Thiel's Silicon Valley companies became private intelligence gathering tools. A similar power center, BlackRock, influences both political parties to direct United States fiscal policy, using crises as opportunities for massive wealth transfers.
Surprised that she would have BlackRock so intimately involved in developing her economic policy, because as I mentioned earlier, BlackRock is really a bipartisan economic advisor. So for example, Larry Fink used to manage Trump's personal fortune, and he was tapped specifically by Trump in the lead up to COVID to help develop the government's fiscal response to COVID. But really, it wasn't a fiscal response to COVID so much as a fiscal response to the U.S. government's lockdown policy, or rather the lockdown policies that were implemented in states but tacitly supported at the federal level. And again, in 2008, they helped organize the bailouts, which of course didn't really benefit Main Street. They benefited Wall Street. And the same was also true with the COVID policy and this whole idea of the going direct reset, which again is based on the research of John Titus, who published an article about going direct on the Solari Report, which is Catherine Austin Fitz's website. And for anyone interested in what is arguably the biggest wealth transfer from regular Americans to the oligarch class in American history, I would really encourage you to go and read his investigation. It's very eye-opening. So essentially what happened with going direct is that, previously there was this policy of quantitative easing, or rather, wanton money printing after the 2008 economic crisis that was going on, in the U.S. Federal Reserve System. And so BlackRock created this plan at the end of 2019 for the next crisis, that in the next crisis, the Federal Reserve should consider going direct. And so what that meant is that they would do the same money printing they did before, but instead of giving it to public sector entities, they would put it directly in the hands of Wall Street, like BlackRock. And then when the next downturn started, not necessarily when COVID started, but it actually started not long after like a month really after BlackRock made that proposal. The repo market in the US started to go totally haywire, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York started to intervene in that market and implement BlackRock's going direct policy. That continued from then all the way up until COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And then they just went into complete overdrive, printing all of this money and handing out to Wall Street. And then the BlackRock heavy involvement in what became the government's COVID fiscal policy, overseen by people like Mnuchin For example, they were put in charge of a lot of these funding facilities that the federal government set up, supposedly to bail out Main Street from the lockdown policies. And instead of BlackRock using that money to help regular Americans, they bought shares in their own ETFs, and nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. And so this is a company that doesn't give a damn about the American people. All it cares about is creating profit for shareholders and the people whose money it manages, creating, greater profits for them, which in the past included Donald Trump himself and a lot of other, major oligarch figures that back Republicans, and they also back Democrats. Larry Fink himself, I think, is pretty overtly a Democrat supporter. But again, this is a company that's so powerful, and its connections to the U.S. government and U.S. government fiscal policy are so intertwined that you're going to see BlackRock involved in the next crisis to come, regardless of whether Kamala wins or Trump wins, because when Trump won, he called Larry Fink up and was like, Larry, develop a policy that, the government was actually already implementing before them, but just gave him free rein to go even crazier and steal all of our, hyperinflate the dollar and destroy regular Americans' purchasing power, and then give all this extra money that was printed directly in the hands of BlackRock. And so, a lot of the people now that blame all of the inflation on Biden, it was really Trump began that policy, but because of all the BlackRock people in the Biden administration, it was continued through until, the COVID fiscal response changed and they decided that COVID was over. And, the BlackRock stuff is going to continue, like I said, regardless of who wins. And actually, there have been really prominent people from, the U.S. political sphere that have pointed out that the next administration is very likely to grapple with some major U.S. government debt crisis. And so I think it's very safe to assume that whether it's Kamala or Trump in office, you're going to have BlackRock brought in to, quote unquote, solve the U.S. government debt crisis, because that's who Obama called on in 2008. That's who Trump called on during COVID. And, Kamala surrounded herself with BlackRock goons as far as her economic policy team is concerned. And, I think it's very unfortunate, but it's very telling. And it's also important to point out that BlackRock is trailblazing this whole idea of tokenizing real world assets. So basically, they're trying to make new forms of digital gold, kind of like I guess like Bitcoin's been called that, for example, but they're trying to basically tokenize major aspects of the natural world, which they say are like, this rainforest, this national park is of a finite supply. It's of a finite size. So we can tokenize each hectare or each acre of that and link it to like a token or something and trade it on the blockchain and make all of this money. That's basically, they're about to turn nature into a giant Wall Street casino, and it's going to be supported by Kamala or Trump because they framed it as, sustainable development. And this is going to stop climate change, but it's not. It's going to create an entire new asset class for Wall Street and allow their insane casino to keep going for the next 100 years plus.
According to Webb, BlackRock's ultimate goal is to create new financial markets by commodifying even nature itself. This immense economic power intersects with the activities of lobby groups like AIPAC that shape United States foreign policy, revealing how political and financial interests are deeply intertwined.
As far as AIPAC goes as an organization, what a lot of people don't know is that they've also been caught being involved in espionage operations, even though they weren't charged for it formally. I forget the exact nature of what happened, but it was reported on pretty early on, I think, by Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com back when it was happening. And it was I think a guy at the Pentagon was passing classified information to officials at AIPAC, who then passed it on to the Israeli government. And the case was essentially like shut down and very poorly handled, and pretty much everyone involved should have gone to prison. And there was also an espionage scandal involving AIPAC in the 1980s. And AIPAC is funded, a lot of it is funded by this group of Zionist billionaires, or historically has been, that are loosely known as the Mega Group, which is sort of the nickname that the Wall Street Journal gave them. Back in the late 90s, but this was created in 1991 by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman, and so intimately involves Wexner, the Bronfman family, the Crowns, who were actually a major force behind Obama's political career. And, a lot of, these other figures that have had an outsized role in donating to AIPAC. And Wexner in particular has a lot of influence on AIPAC as well. I think one of the top people at AIPAC, a couple of years ago, essentially bragged that most of the top people in the organization had previously, been Wexner fellows. So, undergone sort of like the Wexner philanthropic leadership training courses and all of that. And so a lot of these billionaires, as I wrote in my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, have historic ties to organized crime, specifically the Crowns, the Bronfmans, and Leslie Wexner himself. And so, they've tried to sort of dominate a lot of U.S. foreign policy decisions as it relates to Israel and have, questionable interests. And a lot of their organized crime ties, I think, are very important because if you look at the creation of the State of Israel, particularly its national security state in the late 40s, it involved a significant amount of organized crime figures in the United States who were trafficking weapons to the Haganah, which is the precursor to the IDF. And so once the Haganah transformed into the IDF and a lot of these other groups became that were, paramilitary groups before the creation of the State of Israel, they had all these ties to, essentially what was the Jewish mob in the United States, and those ties persisted. And that particular network of organized crime, it is directly tied to these billionaires I just mentioned. And so, I think that helps sort of flesh out why this relationship is that way, and also helps explain why you have so many collaborations over the years between CIA and Mossad. And so, I argued in some past work at when I worked at Mint Press News that really what we have at this point is a binational security state because of the lot of policies that have been made. But it really goes back to this nexus at the end of, the end of the 1940s when organized crime sort of got really involved, not just with U.S. intelligence, but also in the creation of Israel's national security state. As well. And so AIPAC is sort of a lobby group for a lot of those interests.
Webb claims this powerful lobbying is rooted in a history where intelligence and organized crime networks became intertwined. This historical alliance has evolved into today's binational security state between the United States and Israel, an inseparable structure, especially in technology and cybersecurity.
Unlikely, at least in the short to medium term. And there would have to be some major structural change in the U.S. political system, I think, for that relationship to be broken. And there's a couple of reasons I say this, but one reason that's sort of overlooked that I reported on a lot when I worked for Mint Press News is that there's a particular billionaire who's very close to the Zionist fold, who's forgetting his first name, but his last name is Singer. And he created this organization called Startup Nation Central with a bunch of people with connections to the Israeli government. And basically his goal there was to have these Israeli intelligence connected startups promoted, and specifically to U.S. companies to facilitate their mergers with U.S. companies as a way to have Israeli intelligence veterans in key positions in the U.S. tech industry to prevent any sort of meaningful embrace of the boycott, divest, sanctions movement or BDS movement against Israel. And this was back in like 2012. So this has been something that they've been concerned about potentially happening, I would argue, for a long time. And there's been extreme efforts to sort of yoke together the infrastructure of the military and also the national security state of the U.S. To, infrastructure service providers or software developers that are from, Israeli intelligence. And some of these are quite disconcerting. So in 2019, one of these companies that's a contractor to the U.S. military is a cybersecurity firm called Cybereason. And Cybereason did all of these very weird simulations with U.S. law enforcement about a hack disrupting a U.S. presidential election and what would be needed to have the election canceled and martial law declared in the country. And this particular company was created by Israeli intelligence veterans, one of whom, the head of it, overtly says that his work at Cybereason is a continuation of his work at Israel's Unit 8200, which is essentially like the Israeli NSA equivalent, signals intelligence. And they contract for major aspects of U.S. military infrastructure now. So, when you are a cybersecurity company, you also get a lot of access to the most essential systems that you're ostensibly trying to protect. But this is, a foreign intelligence and foreign military, using its veterans and sort of embedding them in major aspects of U.S., national security infrastructure, which is a huge U.S. national security risk, but it never gets talked about. And, again, I would go back to the argument that the intention for decades has been to build a binational security state to prevent the U.S. separating itself from Israel in any meaningful way. And I think that's also true of some other countries as well, like the UK, for example. And I think that's why you had Netanyahu a few years ago in referring to the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which is really most of the English-speaking world, saying that Israel is really the second eye of the Five Eyes, in that it, essentially dominates a lot of this infrastructure, cybersecurity infrastructure for these countries as well. And Netanyahu in 2012 oversaw under his administration back then, oversaw the development of this cybersecurity, I guess you could say, intelligence policy, where a lot of operations that used to be done in-house in Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies were going to be spun off into private cybersecurity companies. So essentially admitting that the policy was to use the Israeli cybersecurity tech industry and also other aspects of the tech industry as fronts for Israeli intelligence. It's like an admitted policy they've had since 2012. I think it's very unlikely that because of how extensive the connection of U.S. critical infrastructure is to Israel or companies tied to Israel, it would be very hard for any meaningful separation to take place. And I don't just mean that in terms of military. You may remember, a year or two ago, maybe it was a little more recent, there was some sort of hack on some water system. I forget what state it was, but there was a lot of fear mongering about hackers. And that particular, water system or dam or whatever it was controlled by an Israeli company or managed by an Israeli company. And, I guess some people argue that this is fine because Israel is, supposedly the U.S.'s greatest ally. But that's not necessarily true. There's Netanyahu, for example, pushing for the invasion of Iraq, for example, that was not really in the U.S.'s best interest in terms of a national security perspective, along with the war on terror. And really, the neocons in the U.S. were pushing it through, but conservatism basically seeks to align U.S. and Israeli foreign policy goals, basically conflating Israeli policy goals with U.S. policy goals. So, that obviously complicates things, even more. And so there's this very extensive relationship that a lot of people, I think, don't really understand. And it was intentionally set up this way, I think, to prevent the voice of the people from being heard.
According to Webb, this binational security state is so profound that it was designed to make any meaningful United States separation from Israel impossible. One of the most concrete examples of this complex web of power, finance, and intelligence is the case of Jeffrey Epstein.
I have kind of an unconventional conclusion about a lot of the stuff that ended up going down with Epstein. I think a lot of the focus on the coverage on sex trafficking distracts from the fact that Epstein, I think his main job wasn't sex blackmail and sex trafficking, though that obviously did occur. I think his main focus throughout the arc of his career, which really began in the 70s and then goes up until his arrest in 2019, was being a currency manipulator and a financial hitman, essentially, for intelligence agencies. So basically, shorting currencies, collapsing currencies, or bumping currencies up. He was part of a group of people that did that historically. The first instance we have of Epstein sort of hobnobbing with the elite is with a man named Jimmy Goldsmith, who was like a notorious currency speculator and currency trader. And that's why we have, for example, in 1995, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild now, wrote a letter to Bill Clinton when he was president in 95 saying she wanted to talk to him about Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization, why the Mexican peso was collapsing, which ultimately related and ended with things like Citigroup buying one of Mexico's biggest banks and all of this stuff. Anyway, there's a lot to say there, but basically one of the people that shorted that peso and made a bunch of money was part of the same group that Goldsmith was a part of, a guy named Joe Lewis, who was also incidentally part of the FTX scandal more recently. So Jeffrey Epstein was when he was interviewed by prominent journalists for the New York Times and others, was frequently seen trading currencies and involved in Forex markets. He was very involved in Bear Stearns' efforts to digitalize Forex trading and all of that. Back in the 80s, after he was sort of forced out of Bear Stearns, he developed some sort of financial relationship with U.S. intelligence. And according to him, he was helping hide or helping find stolen money for powerful people, mostly billionaires. So if you're hiding and also finding stolen money for people, not only are you a financial criminal, but you have a very intimate understanding of the shadow banking system, of money laundering, and things like that. And also he was involved, it appears, with a significant amount of tax evasion and how to structure nonprofits as a way to sort of, you not really have them be framed as philanthropic organizations, but really they're like covert companies, which is why he was so involved in helping set up the Gates Foundation and helping set up the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative and all of this stuff. So I think a lot of efforts have been made to have the focus on Epstein just be on the sex crimes and not on all the other stuff he was doing, because if they were to focus on sort of the bigger picture, it would be very problematic for very, very powerful people on both sides of the political divide. And I do think it's absolutely true that there were efforts to use, sexual blackmail to manipulate powerful people or to buy them out or to secure their compliance with certain things, because if you have compromised someone, you can control and influence them in unprecedented ways. And so something I pointed out in my book is that,
in essence, Whitney Webb suggests Epstein's primary role was less about sexual blackmail and more about financial operations on behalf of intelligence. However, this financial power was accompanied by dark methods like sexual blackmail, a tool the same criminal networks have used for decades to control political figures.
Sexual blackmail has been used by this network in which Epstein was part. For decades. And it goes back to the same thing I referenced earlier about sort of this merging of intelligence and organized crime back in the immediate post-World War II era, because traditionally sex blackmail and that kind of stuff and sex trafficking, all of that's what the mob did. Same with arms trafficking. These were mob rackets, and later the CIA, in the US at least, took over a lot of those rackets or helped run them in conjunction with these elements of organized crime, because a lot of these mobster guys later became key parts of CIA death squads and assassination teams and all of that stuff all over the world. So that's something that really has persisted throughout time. And so in this particular world, in this particular network in which Epstein swam, this type of behavior was actually not that uncommon. So for example, one of Epstein's clients in the 1980s was a very intelligence connected arms dealer named Adnan Khashoggi, and Adnan Khashoggi had a yacht, and he would sexually compromise and blackmail people there. Right. And another guy named Roy Cohn, who was very much tied up with the same, not necessarily with Epstein directly, but the same sort of like New York City based power networks that later Epstein became part of. Roy Cohn was also very involved in sexual blackmail with organized crime, and was pretty much overtly like a lawyer for major figures in organized crime, while also having a major foot in the Reagan administration, for example. And Roy Cohn was also the mentor to Donald Trump, and the place where Roy Cohn was very involved in that he and his associates in that used to blackmail people was later sold to Donald Trump, who had like questionable parties at the Plaza Hotel in New York in the early 90s, allegedly involving underage girls. Again, none of this has really been that investigated, but there is a lot of commonalities, and there's a lot of other sex blackmail scandals as well, like the Profumo affair that was sort of like a UK, US sex blackmail scandal. There's just been a lot of these throughout, throughout history, but I guess it's just not something you're taught in school. So, for this particular network, again, that Epstein was inhabiting and the oligarchs he was, serving or fronting for, this kind of stuff actually happened perhaps more often than not. So again, I think the media coverage attempting to frame Epstein as an anomaly is very mistaken in this regard. And it actually goes on a lot more extensively than we've been led to believe. And I certainly think that a lot of the people he was attempting to benefit as it related to blackmail, there's definite Israeli connections there. But again, I would argue that the network, and I argue in the book that the network that Epstein was really working for is sort of this CIA Mossad blob that grew out of sort of these parts of the CIA that were very teamed up with